Welcome back to the table, friends. I'm your humble host, GreyDMs, and with me, as always, is my co-host and co-conspirator, Owen.
Hi.
You're listening to Tabletop by Night, a weekly podcast where we continue our exploration of Vampire the Masquerade. Tonight, we gather around the table to answer the question, is it Halloween yet?
No, it's not.
I mean, it will be in a few days.
Yeah, sure.
So for us, Halloween might be a little bit in the future, but we believe Halloween's right around the corner for you if I've managed to keep my life together.
If you're listening to this, you're time travelers.
Yay. So we thought, why not take this opportunity to start exploring some real life content of people who claim they were vampires or that there were vampires.
Okay.
So today we have
they were vampires, so they got better.
They were vampires. I did get better.
I got better.
She turned me into a newt. So all of these come from various internet, mostly historical sites, as these are historical stories of situations in which what we're telling you is true. Mm-hmm. However, the people went and interpret this as these are vampires instead of other solutions. There's always probably explanations here, but hey, let's say some creepy stories for, Halloween and maybe get people in the mood for a little bit fun.
Spooky.
Yeah. We like to play the spookies during Halloween.
Oh my God. We're such middle-aged men.
We like to sit in our home and shut the lights down and hope kids do not come up and eat our candy.
Don't walk on my lawn.
My candy. Oh, yeah. So to start, we're going to talk about something called the Breslau Vampire.
Ew.
So 1591
to
1592. There was an unnamed vampire who terrorized Breslau, Germany, after committing suicide. The Breslau Vampire exhibited behavior associated with the old hag syndrome.
What's that?
I don't know. It's very interesting that it's the old hag syndrome.
Sleep paralysis. Common sleep disruption that occurs when the mind wakes up, but the body is still paralyzed during REM sleep.
Oh, so old hag syndrome is sleep paralysis.
Mm-hmm.
Very interesting.
Yeah, just symptoms of sleep paralysis.
On September 20th, 1591, a well-to-do shoemaker stunned his family in the city by slitting his throat with a knife for no known reason.
Hello, family.
This is a cheerful start. As suicides were a sin and a disgrace upon the family, his wife, who had just given birth, and her sisters sought to hide the cause of his death. They told others he had died of a stroke and refused visitors. They quietly made funeral arrangements and hired an old woman to wash the corpse and completely tie up and cover the fatal wound. The widow and the old woman laid the corpse in a coffin. They finally allowed the priest to visit and view the body, but the wound was so well hidden that he detected nothing suspicious. On the third day after the suicide, the shoemaker's body was buried with a splendid funeral befitting the rich. Despite the family's efforts, the secret of the suicide leaked out and rumors began circulating about the city. At first, people refused to believe it, but the rumors grew so persistent that the city's council made inquiries. The shoemaker's family made up more lies. They said that he had fallen and injured himself on a sharp rock and that sharp awl had been found in his clothing. The rumors persisted, however, and the councils considered what action to take. The widow's friends pleaded with her to prevent her husband from being exhumed or moved to unhallowed ground, or even worse, declared to be a sorcerer. I love how, declared to be a sorcerer is a horrific thing many times throughout our history to befall a woman. Declared to be a sorcerer this day and age is metal as hell.
I'm sorry, your husband is dead, but good news, he was probably a sorcerer.
Meanwhile, a restless ghost looking like the shoemaker began appearing both day and night. It terrified people by making horrible noises, causing nightmares, and sexually assaulting them. See old hag.
It's just a creepy old guy.
Uncle?
Likes to get shit-faced in the woods. Comes and starts sexually harassing people.
The harassments increased, and finally the shoemaker's family went to the president of the court and said the man was being abused in his grave, and they desired to take the matter to the Kaiser. The ghost now appeared The ghost now appeared at sundown every day, and no one in the city was free of it. According to an account in the Prussian folklore, the one most bothered were those who wanted to rest after heavy work. Often it came to their bed, often it actually laid down in it and was like to smother the people. Indeed, it squeezed them so hard that not without astonishment people could see the marks left by its fingers, so that one could easily judge the so-called stroke. Oh, come on.
I still think this is like the creepy drunk guy out in the woods.
I know, the criticizing his so-called stroke. In the manner, the people who were fearful in any case became yet more fearful, so that they did not remain longer in their houses, but sought more secure places. Most of them, not secure in their bedchambers, stayed in the rooms after bringing many others in, so that their fear was dispersed by the crowd. Nonetheless, although they all worked with burning lights, the ghost came anyway. Often everyone saw it, but often just a few, of whom it always harassed some. After 8 months of suffering the council ordered the body to be publicly disinterred on April 18th, 1592. The account continues. In the open grave, they found the body complete and undamaged by decay, but blown up like a drum, except that nothing was changed and the limbs all still hung together. They were, which was remarkable, not stiffened, like those of other dead people, but one could move them easily. On his feet the skin had peeled away, and another had grown, much purer and stronger than the first, and as almost all sorcerers are marked on an out-of-the-way place, so that one does not notice it easily, so did he have on his big toe a mole like a rose.
Look at that.
No one knew the meaning of this.
Of course, it's just a freaking mole.
That's great. There was also no stench to be noticed, except that the clothes in which he was wrapped had a repulsive smell.
There's no smell, but
his clothes
smells.
The wound in his throat gaped open and was reddish and not changed in the slightest.
Ooh.
For several days, the corpse was aired during the day and stored in a house at night. It was guarded around the clock. During the daytime, curious townfolk came to view it, but the exhumation did nothing to abate the vampire attacks. The next remedy tried was the burial of the corpse under a gallows, but this only incited the vampire to increase the intensity of his assaults. The corpse seemed to get fuller in flesh. Finally, the widow broke down and admitted that her husband had committed suicide and said that the city officials could deal with him as they see fit. According to Montague Summers, wherefore the 7th of May he was again digged up, and it was observable that he was grown more sensibly fleshy since his last interment. To be short, they cut off the head, arms, and legs of the corpse, and opened his back, took out his heart, which was as fresh and entire as a calf newly killed. These, together with his body, they put on a pile of wood and burnt them to ashes, which they carefully sweeping together and putting into a sack, that none might get them for wicked uses, poured them into the river, after which the spectrum was never seen more.
Okay.
The shoemaker's maid, who died after him, also returned and assaulted a fellow servant at night, laying on the woman so heavily that her eyes swelled. The spirit appeared in the forms of a hen, cat, and goat, and bedeviled others to the point where the maid's body was disinterred and burned. Her attacks ceased.
What the fuck?
Like, it's this dude. And then this woman shows up and starts assaulting people. Maybe he was like distraught at being caught with the maid or something, and the maid was like pissed that he died. I don't know. I mean, it's creepy.
Yeah, it is. Unfortunately, you don't really know what really happened.
Yeah. I mean, this is weird. It's just like, oh, I got attacked by a hen, a cat, and a goat. I saw the maid's eyes in all of them. Like, really? Okay. I mean, hey.
The thing they leave out is just like, yeah, his body's not decomposing. Well, it's freaking winter.
They're just like, oh, the skin is all taut and fresh, but it's completely expanded.
Yeah. Kind of bloated.
So you mean he's past the rigor mortis period? He's just basically decaying at this point. Oh, whatever. Interesting. Very interesting. It would be creepier if we weren't laughing so much, but them's the breaks.
All right. Coventry Street Vampire, 1922. was a vampire scare in London. On the night of the full moon in April 1922, an enormous black bat-like creature with a 6-foot wingspan was reported flying around West Drayton Church in London. Several people said they witnessed it dive down into the cemetery and prowl about the tombs. 2 policemen gave it chase, causing it to emit a blood-curdling screech and fly away. An old man opined that the creature was the spirit of a vampire who, in the 1890s, had murdered a woman by drinking her blood. Later, on April 16th, around 6 a.m., a man walking down Coventry Street in London's West End felt himself seized by an invisible presence and bitten on the neck. He felt as though his blood were being sucked out, and he fell unconscious. When he awakened in Charing Cross Hospital, doctors said he appeared to have been stabbed with a thin tube. 2.5 hours later, a second unconscious man was brought to the same hospital. He was bleeding heavily from the neck. When he regained consciousness, he also told of being attacked by an invisible presence while walking down Coventry Street. Later in the evening, a third victim with the same story and wounds was admitted to the hospital. All 3 said they'd been stabbed at exactly the same spot. Rumors of a vampire on the loose circulated. The police had no apparent leads. Another rumor circulated that the police had hired a vampire hunter who had tracked the creature down and taken it to the Highgate Cemetery. Just looks weird. Where they drove a stake through its heart. That rumor apparently originated in Covent Garden Pub. It is not known whether the mystery of the Coventry Street Vampire was ever solved, but the attacks apparently stopped. See, my first thought on this, lady of the night, guy stiffed her, and she stabbed him in the neck. Damn. And then another guy did that. Like, it just kind of became a thing.
Well, it's like all 3 said they got stabbed around the same place.
Yeah, and then, like, the first guy's there in the hospital, and then the second guy shows up, and they're just like, oh, what happened to you? Did you get bit by a vampire like that guy over there? And he's like, yeah.
Is my wife here? Yeah.
Yeah.
It was a vampire.
Vampire sucked my blood right out of me.
Him just taking the blood right out of me. He took some money, too. Just a little bit.
God. They hired a vampire hunter.
Like that completely reeks of me of like the cops, basically. Like a bunch of crazy people. Like, what are you going to do about the vampires? Like, look, we've hired the best in the business.
Vampire hunter.
Last night he went out and staked the beast. Okay, you're all good. Like,
he did. I tell you, he did.
Pitar Bledjevic was a Serbian peasant born in 1662. He spent most of his life in the Serbian village of Kislova.
I'm glad you got this.
Kislova?
Sure. Yeah, that sounds correct.
Yeah, Kislova ought to be modern day Kisilva. Oh my God. Really? Okay, let's just pick it from the top. Pitar Bledjevic was a Serbian peasant born in 1662. He spent most of his life in the Serbian village of Kisilova, often thought to be modern day Kisiljevo, and lived a perfectly unremarkable life until his death of unknown causes in 1725. Aside from being really hard to pronounce, following his death, the small village was hit by a spate of mysterious deaths. Within 8 days, 9 people had perished. Oof. Each of them had suddenly been struck down by a mysterious illness 24 hours before their deaths. Such deaths are not uncommon in village life at the time, but what was unusual was that those who died each had the same horrifying story to tell. On their deathbeds, each claimed to have been throttled by their recently deceased neighbor. During this period, his widow also came forward claiming that he had visited her in the night asking for opensi, shoes. She fled the village and moved away soon after.
Getting the hell out of here.
And that's crazy. Well, I guess like he was leaving.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's just a weird thing. It's just like, oh, I have something to confess. You know, my dead husband came and visited me the night. I'm like, oh my gosh, ma'am, please tell him. What did he ask for? Shoes.
Ask for shoes.
He showed up and asked for shoes. Oh, okay. I have to leave.
He was telling me it's time to get out of here.
It's time to leave. Other stories about this man soon started to appear, each more alarming than the last. Another tale claimed that he returned home at night and demanded food from his son. When the young man refused, his father is said to have brutally murdered him, biting him to death and drinking his blood. Oof. I guess if you're not going to give me food, you are food.
Yeah.
The superstitious locals declared that his body should be disinterred and examined for signs of vampirism. This meant checking to see if his hair, beard, or nails had grown and to see if the body had suitably decomposed.
Mm-hmm.
Digging up the dead, unsurprisingly, was frowned upon, so the villagers demanded that the local officer, cameral provisor, Formbald, along with the local priest, attended the inspection. Frombald tried to object, saying he needed permission from the authorities in Belgrade, but his pleas fell on deaf ears. Frombald begrudgingly attended the examination of the exhumed body with Veliko Gradiste priest. According to his notes, he was very concerned that the body did indeed match up with descriptions of vampires. Supposedly, the corpse was undecomposed, and his hair and beard had grown out. Most disturbingly, blood could be seen in and around his mouth, and he had grown new skin and nails where the old ones had been peeled away. His report went on to detail how the distressed locals, now convinced they were dealing with a vampire, decided to stake it through the heart. Frumbald, still not fully sure, was not convinced, but once again decided to let the villagers continue.
We'll burn you at the stake if you don't let us stake this guy in the head.
I mean, basically, it's a dead body. You're like, all right, and maybe it's not respectful, but what are you going to do? He recorded how, after being staked, the body spewed fresh blood from his ears and mouth. The villagers then cremated what was left of the body to make sure he could not rise again. Frumbald concluded his report by requesting that the authorities not hold him responsible for what had occurred. He described the villagers as beside themselves with fear and made it clear that exhumation and staking were the only proper choices. As it turned out, the authorities weren't too concerned and never looked into the case.
We really don't care.
A staked corpse was likely a small price to pay to keep the populace sane, and that's pretty much the end of the story. While tales of vampires had circulated for a long time, Frumbald's story stands out as one of the few documented testimonies of vampire beliefs in Eastern Europe. It appeared in the Wienerisches Diarium of Venice newspaper and quickly spread across Europe. Reports like these contributed to vampire craze of the 18th century, not just in the East, but in Germany and France and in England. Kind of interesting, huh?
Very interesting. All right. Edwin Brown was wasting away. For the better part of 2 years, he grew increasingly thin and weak. Tuberculosis ravaged the once strapping young man in March 1892. Edwin struggled to breathe as he continually coughed up blood. He had sought a cure in the rarefied air and mineral waters of Colorado Springs. Been there. Colorado, but the 18-month trip offered no healing powers and only left him homesick for a small town in America's tiniest state. Edwin Brown returned home to Exeter, Rhode Island, where his father tilled the soil as a Yankee farmer. George Brown had watched helplessly as the disease known as consumption took the lives of his wife, Mary Brown, in 1883, followed by his 20-year-old daughter, Mary Olive, 6 months later. While his only son grew weaker and weaker in the winter of 1892, tuberculosis also took his 19-year-old daughter, Mercy Lena Brown, who passed away after a year of sickness on January 1892. Wow. So in a very short period of time, this guy lost every relative. The disease that took 3 members of George Brown's family was the top killer of its time in the 18th and 19th centuries, particularly in New England. Tuberculosis passed easily between people in close quarters, which is why it tended to sweep through entire families such as the Browns. While the disease was all too common for the townspeople of Exeter, what happened next certainly wasn't. In 1892, tuberculosis was still poorly understood. It wasn't widely known what caused the disease or how it spread. Doctors were unable to explain the wave of sickness washing over George Brown's family, but relatives and friends thought they knew where they could find the cause, 6 feet under. With medical science failing to help Edwin Brown, distraught Exeter residents turned to superstition and the supernatural in a desperate attempt to save his life. 200 years after the Salem witch trials, a vampire hysteria gripped the New England town. A group of Exeter residents believed that Edwin's mother or one of his sisters may be undead, caught between heaven and hell, and sucking the life out of him from beyond the grave, which meant the cure could rest within their bodies. Oh, God, that's gross. With the extremely reluctant blessing of George Brown, who at first discounted the vampire theory, his relatives and neighbors visited the Brown family plot in the town's Chestnut Hill Cemetery on March 17, 1892. In the small graveyard behind the town's Baptist church, they exhumed the bodies of Mary Brown and Mary Olive Brown. They opened the casket and, as would be expected, found only their bones inside. The townspeople then turned their attentions to the casket of Mercy Brown, who had died 8 weeks earlier. Accounts differ as to whether Mercy's body had already been buried or if it rested in a crypt until the ground could thaw and undertakers could dig a grave. Yeah, I mean, if it's frozen, it's not going to decay. However, when the lid was lifted off Mercy's coffin, the body was found on her side. Her face appeared flush, and there was blood in the heart and her veins. Wow, they went that far. Dr. Harold Metcalf, who had raised his objections to the entire affair, assured everyone that the lack of decomposition of Mercy's body was perfectly consistent with the fact that she had been dead for less than 2 months. Knowing that medicine had done nothing to save the Browns, the people of Exeter ignored the doctor's proclamations and took the presence of fresh blood in Mercy's heart as a sign that she was undead. They gathered firewood and kindled a bonfire on a pile of nearby rocks. Then they cut out Mercy's heart and lungs and cremated them on the pyre. They returned to Edward Brown's house with the ashes of his dead sister's heart and mixed them with water. Edwin consumed the concoction, but the tuberculosis continued to consume him. He died 2 months later, on May 2nd, 1892. This was not the first time the folk remedy of burning the organs of the dead and mixing the ashes into an elixir for the sick had been tried in Rhode Island, even in Exeter. In 1799, the townspeople exhumed the dead body of Sarah Tillinghast, suspecting her of being a vampire. Author Diane Ross McCain reports that there were 18 documented instances of the exhumation of family members and suspected vampire cases throughout New England in the 18th and 19th century. But the case of Mercy Brown would be the last. After digging up Mercy Brown, the townspeople buried her heartless body in the ground of Chestnut Hill Cemetery, where under a weathered tombstone she now rests in peace.
Okay. I know last time when we dug up a family member and we cremated it, the guy still died. Work. But look,
this time
it's a vampire. This is gonna work, okay? Like, I'm
definitely a vampire.
I got a feeling about this one.
I mean, this is one of those things, though, too. When I think about it, like in 200, 300 years, people are gonna be like, they shot themselves up with insulin to take care of diabetes. Like, ridiculous. Don't they know they could just take this pill and then?
Okay, here's the last one. This one is a little interesting. I'm glad because of the time period, but like the place it took place, I was a little concerned about because Nuremberg in Germany.
Ooh, what was the time period?
1971. So
okay, I was like, this is gonna be really interesting.
Yeah, the year was 1971. It was early springtime in Nuremberg, Germany. A series of exhumed corpses were found exhibiting signs that they had fresh bites taken out of them and that they had been gnawed on. Many of the female corpses showed signs of sexual contact. Most had been mutilated with a knife, some were beheaded, a few had their hearts cut out. Eventually, between 1971 and 1972, police found no fewer than 35 bodies that were violated in this manner. Since they were all treated in the same way, chewing, mutilating, and necrophilia, this was thought to be the work of one seriously disturbed individual, but this was just the beginning. On May 6, 1972, a young man named Marcus Alder and his fiancée, 18-year-old Ruth Lissy, were both found shot to death in their car. Their bodies were mistreated in the same manner as those found in the cemetery. There were signs that someone had drunk the young woman's blood. Bavarian police now had a murder on their hands. Not long after the incident with Alder and Lissy, another local young woman was found shot with signs of blood being harvested from her dead body. Try as they may, police were having no luck in tracking down the murderer. Newspapers of the day referred to the unknown killer as the Vampire of Nuremberg.
Creative.
Then there was a clue. One night in late May of 1972, George Wormuth, A morgue attendant was making his rounds through the cemetery when he spotted a dark outline of someone who should not have been there. Under the cover of darkness, Wormoth snuck up on the figure and saw that it was a man kissing a recently disinterred corpse. The man was startled by the sight of the morgue attendant and as a result pulled out a pistol and fired off a shot in his direction.
I love those. It's like, you scared me so much I got to pull out a gun and shoot you.
He then hurried off into the darkness. Fortunately, the shot missed Wormoth and he got a good look enough at the sick bastard to offer an excellent description to the local authorities. Police used the information to track down the perpetrator. They arrested a 41-year-old deaf-mute German man by the name of Kuno Hoffmann. Hoffman, not surprisingly, had a long history of severe mental problems.
I'll say.
He had been in and out of institutions his entire life, escaping from them a total of 12 times. It was also not shocking to discover that Hoffman had done some time in prison. By all accounts, Hoffman had a brutal childhood where he was abused routinely by his alcoholic father. It was this abuse that left him deaf and mute and psychologically scarred for life.
Imagine just beating someone so bad they go deaf and mute.
Instead of denying his evil deeds, once in custody, Hoffman was quick to confess to the grave robberies, unspeakable violations, and murders. He explained how he moved to molesting corpses from fresh graves once it became difficult to get his hands on the newly dead in morgues. He told how he would browse the local newspaper for death notices to determine his next victims. Hoffman had managed to obtain a set of keys to the local cemetery and used these to give himself access to the bodies in the dead of the night. When the supply of newly dead no longer satiated him, Hoffman turned to murder. We are naturally tempted to wonder why one would commit such heinous acts as if any reason would suffice. When asked, Hoffman offered an explanation. While incarcerated, he developed a strong interest in the occult. The killer read numerous volumes on Satanism, black magic, vampirism, and dark rituals. He referred to these as the occult sciences.
Ooh.
Hoffman explained that he did what he did in an attempt to make himself stronger and more handsome. Yes, you read right, stronger and more handsome. He continued his self-schooling in the occult sciences once he was discharged from prison. Putting his body of knowledge into practice, Hoffman performed his rituals with the bodies he dug up. This failed to help him achieve his goals, so he switched to live victims since the blood was fresher and of high quality. Am I not pretty to you? With a story as bizarre and surreal as his, no one could determine if he was sane enough to take trial for his evil acts.
Say no.
But stand trial he did, and the defense certainly pushed hard on the insanity angle. After all, what person in his right mind would do these things? The insanity defense ultimately failed, and Hoffman was determined to be able to differentiate right from wrong. Upon conviction, he was sentenced to life in prison, but not before he admitted that he had never been caught. He would have ultimately indefinitely continued his killing spree. It is rumored that one of his last actions before being locked up for good was to ask one last sip of blood from a virgin. His request was denied, and Kuno Hoffman never spent another day as a free man.
Huh. Wonder if he's still alive.
I mean,
does it say how old it was?
He was 41 years old in 1970, so I mean, he'd be in his late 70s.
Yeah.
No, I mean, he'd be dead.
Yeah,
he's probably dead.
Unless it worked.
Yeah, he's a really handsome deaf and mute guy sitting there in prison, you know.
It's like, I now regret my decisions.
Maybe I should have been more careful once I got the good juice.
That was good. No, good.
Well, we hope that gave you a little spooky vibes this Halloween week. Maybe, well, not really in the vein of Halloween. We are going to spend the rest of this time giving Owen a chance to basically give us another character from the pending Miami Chronicles that our group will one day go through.
Yeah, that thing I forgot I was going to do. Okay. I was literally staring at the paper and I was like, what is he talking about?
Like,
oh,
we're going to wrap this up, right?
All right. So yeah, I got mine. It's not going to be anything super impressive, but I like this character. I would play this character if I could, but yeah. So as before, I'm not going to say what clan they are, what their position is. I feel like you don't really need... It's going to be obvious who I base this off of. This is another actual person. I think that's going to be obvious pretty quickly if you've played a couple video games. But I still think it's really neat. All right. So, here we go. The prison cell was damp, the air thick with the smell of mildew and sea salt. The woman sat on a cold stone floor, her back against the rough wall, clutching her swollen belly. She had been through worse, battles, storms, betrayals, but this felt different. This felt like the end. Heavy iron shackles bound her ankles, though they served little purpose. Her strength had waned, and the fire that had driven her to defy everything, society, law, death itself, was now a flicker barely holding on. Outside the cell, she could hear the footsteps of the guards as they passed. They didn't speak to her anymore. They had already seen enough of her defiance in the courtroom. When she stood tall with the same fire in her eyes she'd shown on deck during countless raids, they'd sentenced her to hang, just as they had the others. But she'd bought herself time with the only currency left to her, her pregnancy. The night stretched on, and her mind wandered to the past, wild, violent, and full of freedom. She had never been meant for a life of quiet submission. She had taken the seas not just for gold and plunder, but for the thrill of it. The wind at her back, the taste of sea salt on her lips, the chaos of battle. It was a man, of course, who had drawn her into that life, but it was her own fierce will that kept her in it. The crew had followed him, but they had feared and respected her. Now it was all gone, and soon the child grown inside her would be born into chains, a cruel joke played by fate. She had heard rumors in the prison, whispers about what happened to women in her condition. The child might be taken from her, raised by strangers, or left to die, forgotten in some corner of the world. She wouldn't allow that, though. Somehow she would escape. Somehow she would live. On a cold, moonless night, as the guard's footsteps faded, the cell door creaked open. The woman, groggy from hunger, barely registered the figure that slipped inside. They moved silently like a shadow, their face obscured by the hood of a tattered cloak. The air around them was different, cold, almost unnatural. "Who are you?" she asked, her hoarse voice. The figure knelt beside her, reaching out a pale hand to brush her cheek. Their touch was cold, but there was something else, something ancient. "A friend," they said softly, though there was nothing friendly about the voice. Before she could protest, they lifted her easily to her feet, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a surge of strength. She wanted to fight, but the figure held her with gentleness that almost felt cruel in the face of her imprisonment. "You're coming with me," the figure whispered, and though she didn't want to, though her mind screamed to resist, her body followed. They took her far from the prison, through shadowy alleys and out of the city, to a desolate place where no one would find them. It was there, in a hidden corner of the world, that she gave birth, alone except for the figure who had freed her. The child was born in silence, and the moment it entered the world, the figure took it from her. She cried out, her weakened body unable to fight, but the figure's grip was unrelenting. "Your legacy ends here," the figure said, staring down at the newborn, "but your story does not." Before she should speak, before she could protest, the figure leaned in close, and she felt the sharp sting of fangs sinking into her neck. Her vision blurred as blood drained from her, and a darkness unlike any she had known crept into the corners of her mind. But just as she teetered on the edge of death, the figure offered her something else, immortality. Their blood dripped into her mouth, and with it came a surge of power. She felt her body transform, her senses sharpening, her strength returning in ways she couldn't have imagined. The last thing she saw before darkness took her fully was the figure standing over her, holding the child in one arm, a shovel in the other. When she awoke, it was as if no time had passed, but the darkness around her was thick and suffocating, the weight of earth pressed down on her chest. She tried to move where her body was pinned, her arms and legs held by something sharp and unyielding. A stake. She realized with horror that a wooden stake had been driven through her heart, keeping her in a state of helplessness. For what felt like years, she lay buried, locked in a half-dream, her mind drifting between moments of clarity and endless black. She was aware of the world above, faintly, as if through water, but she was unable to move, unable to scream. Her body remained locked in time, buried deep beneath the ground like some cursed treasure. Then one day, something changed. She heard voices, human voices, muffled by a layer of dirt. They were laughing, drunk perhaps, and digging. She could hear the scrape of shovels above her, and with each scoop of earth removed, her senses sharpened and the hunger inside her grew. Finally, the dirt around her face gave way, and she felt cool air on her skin for the first time in decades. A pair of hands reached down, pulling the wooden stake lodged in her chest. The moment it was removed, her body surged to life, or something like it. Her eyes snapped open, and she saw two men standing over her, their faces pale with shock. Without thinking, she lunged. The hunger so long repressed overwhelmed her. In a blur of motion, she tore into them. Their blood flowed into her mouth, rich and warm, and she reveled in it, feeling her strength return with each drop. By the time she came to her senses, both men lay dead at her feet, their bodies limp and drained. She stood, wiping the blood from her lips, and looked down at the open grave they had dug. It was then she remembered the prison, the child, the figure. The pieces began to fall into place. The hunger, the bloodlust, those had taken over those first frenzy moments. But now, as the moonlight bathed her in cold silver, something deeper rose within her. Anger. Not anger at the men she killed. They were nothing, just meat. The anger wasn't even directed at the centuries she'd lost, buried in darkness. Her body trapped in cold while the world moved above her. No, it was directed at the figure, the one who had taken her from the prison, stolen her child, and buried her like a forgotten relic. That anger burned inside her like a brand, white hot and unyielding. As the years passed, the rage didn't fade, but it changed. It became more focused, more deliberate. She no longer thought about revenge in the heat of the moment. She wanted something deeper, vengeance. Vengeance on the one they had stolen from her, who had left her with nothing. Whoever they were, they had taken her child, a piece of her that she would never forget, even as centuries passed. The child would be long gone now, but that loss, that void, remained. Over time, the need for answers festered into a cold, calculated obsession. The figure who had embraced her, had abandoned her, who had buried her like a treasure, would pay. She didn't know where to find them, but she had centuries to look, and she would. Yet, Anne never let her search consume her completely. She was a wanderer by nature, always had been. The sea had called to her as a mortal, and even in this new life, that need... I see the gears starting to turn. That need to travel to roam freely never faded. She adapted quickly, using her pirate instincts to navigate the world of vampires, just as she had mastered the seas. Over the decades, she found inventive ways to remain a nomad on the water, hiding from mortal and kindred authorities alike. Anne stole boats, created her own small, loyal crew from mortals and vampires alike, and kept the coastline, always moving, always hunting. By day, she would find shelter in hidden coves or buried deep in the holds of abandoned ships. By night, she would sail under the stars, taking what she needed to survive and leaving little trace of her existence. To those who dared cross her path, she was a phantom, there one moment and gone the next, leaving destruction behind her wake. But as the decades turned into centuries, the world began to change and the seas grew smaller. The vast oceans that had once been her endless playground were now riddled with technology, with satellites and ships that could track even the most cunning predator. The days of being a freewheeling pirate were behind her. So she shifted her focus. She began moving between the coasts of Florida, setting her sights on the wild, untamed regions that still had some of the freedom she craved. She found refuge in the Florida Keys, the Everglades, and the rugged coastlines. These were places few would follow, where she could still roam in relative peace, where her presence could go unnoticed amid the swamps and the mangroves. The Keys in particular became her territory. She knew those waters well and could navigate them blindfolded if necessary. Anne created a network of hideouts along the islands, abandoned shacks, forgotten shipwrecks, and sunken caves where she could disappear when the need arose. Here she could continue her search for the one who betrayed her, all while maintaining her grip on the coastlines. Over time, she became a feared and respected figure in Florida's kindred circles, though few knew the full extent of who she really was. To most, she was just an old vampire, another relic of a bygone era, who had carved out a territory in the fringes. But to those who crossed her, Anne was far more than that. Her name still carried weight, whispers in the dark corners, the Pirate Queen, the one who had survived both death and undeath, and was still searching for something or someone. She never truly settled, not in the way others did. There always another ship to steal, another hidden island to explore, but the Florida coast and Keys became her anchor, the place she returned to when the seas grew too stormy, or when the weight of her search pressed down on her like an anchor. It was here, along the shores and swamps of Florida, that she built her new empire. But she never forgot her child. That hole in her heart remained, a constant reminder of what had been stolen from her, and she never stopped looking for the one to take it away. One day she would find them, and when she did, they would pay dearly for her betrayal. Until then, she was free to roam just as she always had, forever the pirate at heart, forever chasing the horizon.
It's good. I like it.
Yeah. There's not a whole lot of hints in there, I'm afraid.
Yeah, like
I mean there are and there aren't. There's several hooks there, but
yeah. I mean, so let's say I really like the character. Mm-hmm. I have very clear opinions about Clan, but I have very little understanding of what place you drew of her in the city. That's the confusing part for me.
Okay.
I have an opinion.
Okay,
like,
what's your opinion?
So, like, the one that, like, thematically is written all throughout her story is Lasombra.
Okay.
The call to the ocean, the piracy, the void, like that is just written everywhere. It also just, and I think it goes back to kind of we mentioned before, is like we've gone through all these clans and there's a lot of themes that they share.
Yeah, there are. And that's one, but that is not the correct answer.
So the other two that are really applies, one is very much, if you take away the thematic stuff of the ocean, she's very sounds like Gangrel, like 100%. But then there's also this concept in there that like basically you never have her staying in one place for time. That's Ravnos.
I know.
So like there's some strong like I said, theme, her personal, and like they're like split between 3 different groups. And then there's this whole thing about like hatred, like getting revenge and stuff like that. And anger, I don't want to say it's Bruja because anger is generally opinionated. But like, I mean, a Bruja very much could be a pirate too. So like,
absolutely.
I think it's a good split. I think thematically, La Sombra makes sense if we were like, but we've already said it's a little circumventing it. Gangrel feels right. Ravnos is just weird for that one particular reason.
Yes.
So, yeah, I don't know.
Which one do you feel strongest about?
The strongest about? I think that if that is Gangrel, if she is the Gangrel Primogen, she's terrifying.
You are correct.
Okay. I was like, if you're telling like, who do we need to talk to that's head of our clan? And that, because like we're basically setting up in this weird world where the Primogen are more in control than the Camarilla or the Anarchs because of like the story we're going to tell.
Yep.
And so if you're like, if you need to get crap done in the Gangrel, the only person who commands respect is the pirate queen of, that's like cool as hell.
Do you know who that was based off of?
So okay, go back. So when you said there was a video game character, and then you were talking about like
Assassin's Creed Black Flag.
Oh really?
And Bonnie.
Kid. Oh, okay. I just kept seeing Fallout 4. Like, only the first part. I was just like, oh, this is going in a different direction. I was like, they took my kid. 200 years later, I woke up.
Not quite. No.
I was like, that's a weirdly specific thing. Okay,
no, and Bonnie was a real person. She sailed the seas with, oh my God, I can't remember his name. Jack. Calico Jack Rackham. That's what it was. And so she was on the ship with Calico Jack. He was the captain, but a lot of people kind of felt she was in charge. And then on top of that, there was another woman, Mary Reed. So they were both on the ship. And there was always a speculation that Anne and Mary were a thing. But when they were eventually captured, they were both taken to trial, and all the other members of the crew were hung at the gallows, including Jack. And the two of them pled their belly, which means that they were pregnant. Mary died in prison. She got tuberculosis or something like that, and she died. But Anne survived, but there's no record of what happened to her. We just know that she survived, and that's it.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
And now we know.
Now we know where she is.
She's got up today, and we'll find out what in the future.
Yeah, my vision of her was literally Gangrel pirates. Yeah. Like literally, they have some humans on board that sail the ship or take care of things during the day, but at night it's Gangrel pirates.
No, it's cool. It's like I said, there's that discussion where basically like the themes of the clans, because they were so specific, like you have a tendency of reading something going, oh man, this.
Yeah, it totally La Sombra fits in there, but at the same time, they wouldn't be there.
That's playing into it too much.
And Ravnos too, like that's really interesting for Ravnos, but again, they wouldn't be here.
It's like the thing is, like I said, from the beginning, it really felt like it's, especially like her relationship with her sire, like that's
which I totally left up to you. I didn't even say male or female. That's totally yours.
That's gonna be fun. Just the concept of like how terrifying a person she is, like it's really cool because I do think that like the Gangrel are not gonna, as we read, the Gangrel are not gonna have like a very tightly knit political structure.
Cohesive.
They're gonna have the thing of like there are names that if you get on your side, the others are gonna be like, okay. If she said
it's
we're doing
orcs,
that,
the biggest and the strongest, leads.
If she said we're doing that, I'm not going to argue.
Right.
That's why she's the agent, and I think that's a really cool.
It's like I'm just imagining like something happening, and they're just like, we need to get the boys over here to do something, and all of a sudden like a Carnival cruise ship comes pulling up, but there's just like a shit ton of gangrel like getting ready to just jump off the ship and fuck shit up. Like,
so cool, like the Pirates of the Caribbean, where they're just like walking out of the water.
Oh yeah,
like because they like
that's even cooler.
Yeah, this is gonna be cool stuff. All right, I love it. I think it's great. I think it's a wonderful addition. I think that this is going to be a personality heavy game. You've got some really cool stuff, and most of these characters you will not meet for a very long time.
You have no reason to meet 90% of these people.
Why would you?
Yeah.
But it's that great moment when reading any, manga or anything where like they start drawing the cast and you're like, who's that? Like, what is that person?
Especially when Dale Swanson runs into one of them. Let's see if he survives.
Fantastic. All right, guys. Well, I think we're going to wrap things up here, and we hope that you guys have a fun and safe Halloween, maybe a little spooky.
Do something crazy.
Yeah, have some fun, watch some horror movies, and I guess if you have to, give candy to the kids. Otherwise, eat it yourself.
Eat it yourself. Diabetes.